Well, if you're like me, I've been hearing press releases from various provincial governments talking about progress on their drug reform. What the heck is drug reform? If you're like me and you receive your drugs through a private employer, it's confusing to hear a provincial government talking about drug reform because we get our drugs through the private system. And if you look at Canadian drug costs, this is something worth taking a minute or two to refresh yourself on. Drug costs in Canada now exceed $125 billion per annum, and about 55% of that is borne by the private system, 45% by government programs. Now what's crazy about drugs is they're inflating at, nobody really knows, somewhere between 8 and 15% per annum, depends on the year. So we're looking at about $2.5 billion of increase to the healthcare system, and a portion of the healthcare system that private employers really do sustain. So let's take a look for a minute at what's going on and what this drug reform is. Now you first have to realize in Canada that drugs are really broken into two categories. We have brand names and we have generics. And brand names are still over half of the total drugs used in Canada. Brand names are regulated, they are monitored by a federal board, and that federal, they call it a patent review board. That particular board sort of decides what those drugs are going to cost Canadians, and they do that through a negotiation, and they compare the drugs we're paying for in Canada to other Western world countries. So half of our drug costs are sort of off the table, at least for the provincial governments. They're regulated and controlled by the Patent Review Board, which, by the way, gives a 20-year patent to an eligible new drug. So these are not insignificant sectors of our cost. The other side is the roughly 45% of our drugs that are done through generics. Now generics are off patent, and so they really fall into provincial jurisdictions, and this is where drug reform starts. Provincial governments are the largest consumer, consolidated consumer of drugs in Canada. So they're about 45% of the total drugs bought in Canada. And so what they've done is they've negotiated on behalf of their civil servants and taxpayers that are on publicly funded drug programs. They've negotiated, and they've negotiated really at the point of sale with the pharmacies. So it's really quite interesting. They have, in a couple of different methods in recent years, up until this summer, pushed drug costs on generics from 75% of the equivalent brand name all the way down to 35%. So in some provinces, Ontario, BC, Nova Scotia, they were not going so well with the negotiations, so they just passed legislation and they said the law now states that we're only going to pay 35% for our drugs. Wouldn't that be nice if we could all negotiate like that? Well, it didn't happen that way in all provinces. In Alberta, as an example, they used a different method, still accomplishing the same thing. They pushed what they're willing to pay on a generic down to 35% of equivalent brand name. And they call that drug reform. Now here's what's an interesting twist. Some of the provinces tied the private sector with these public negotiations. And this is not a bad thing, although it's a little socialist. So what they did is they said the price that you give the government, 35% equivalent brand name, is the same price that you have to give the private plans. Now that didn't happen in all provinces, happened in Alberta, but in the provinces where it didn't happen, it created some bad press for the government. They're like, this is a two-tier system. You got your price and you've left us to negotiate our price. And so that was an interesting sort of side point on what we call drug reform. Now you can imagine pharmacies weren't very happy about this. They just got their take cut down to 35%. So there was some pushback. And this caused, of course, a response again by the provincial governments. The pharmacies pushed back. They said, you know what, if you're not going to pay as much for the drugs, then we're going to cut our hours. We're going to shut our small town pharmacies. We're going to push a little more of the manufacturing rebates. We might even increase our dispensing fees, which is the fee they charge for filling the little bottles of drugs. And this is not a small response. The Competition Bureau in Canada in 2008 took a look at just the manufacturing rebates, and we were over $800 million, according to their estimate, in rebates given to pharmacies on the drugs that they dispense. And that's sort of an undisclosed source of revenue. It's really part of our distribution network on retail products. The manufacturer rebates are not uncommon, but it was used by provincial governments as a little bit of a PR issue. So they said, well, you're getting rebates, and you could even use the word kickbacks. And so in Ontario, as an example, and other provinces, they put through legislation. Ontario put through Bill 102. It's called the Transparent Drug System for Patients Act. In BC, they pushed through a Fair Pharmacare Act. Well, these are all words that are very judgmental because they're trying to say, hey, we need to see what we're paying for our drugs, and manufacturer rebates have to be controlled. And that's what was done through that legislation. So in response to sort of the pressure on the pharmacies, many of the provinces also did some nice things for the pharmacies. They increased opportunities for pharmacists to charge fees for advice. And so you'll see that quite a lot. As part of this drug reform is the ability of a pharmacist to offer a fee-based advisory service. Well, that's drug reform in at least a couple of minutes. Keep your eye on this because it's still developing. And my name is Ian Quigley. I'm from Cube Benefit Consulting in Edmonton, Alberta.